So I think we're probably ready to go. What we have on screen now is just a quick hello and welcome to Disability 101 for Exchange Professionals. It's being hosted today by Mobility International USA and the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange. It is part of it's part of our 2024 spring webinar series, and we are thrilled that you were able to join us. And so we'll go to the next slide and do some introductions. So what you have on the screen now, our introduction slide, is a picture of myself as well as a picture of my colleague, Justin. And so I'll toss it over to Justin to tell you a little bit more, not only about himself as a person and his role on the team, but also about Mobility International, MIUSA, and the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange, a little bit about what we do.
That's great. Lindsay, did you introduce yourself too?
You know what, Justin, I'll go after you, thanks.
Okay, great. Well, I guess thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lindsay. My name is Justin Harford, and I'm a program specialist. I've been on the NCDE since 2016. I also studied abroad as a blind student twice when I went to college at UC Berkeley many years ago. And we're really happy to have you all here today. We're just going to go over a very brief introduction of Mobility International and then go into the slides. So the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange, to start, is a grant that is funded by the Department of State. It's been so since the 1990s. And the idea is to support the participation of people with disabilities in international education of all types between the United States and other countries through our consulting services and publications. And the organization that implements that grant is is Mobility International USA, or MIUSA, which is a disability nonprofit that implements a variety of grants from entities like the Department of State, USAID, and others. And without any further ado, I'm going to toss it right back to Lindsay, who is our hostess with the mostest and is the person who's going to be telling you all about Disability 101 today. So take it away, Lindsay.
Thanks so much, Justin. Yes, so I also am on the NCDE team with MIUSA. And part of what brought me to that team is my first exposure to the Clearinghouse, which is another way that we refer to the NCDE team. And MIUSA as a whole is, I, like Justin, I'm a disabled person myself. And my experience with Exchange, I'd say probably started a little bit later than I would have liked. I didn't study abroad at all as an undergrad. And I'm going to go a little bit more depth into this a bit later in the presentation. But just to say, my first exposure to the NCDE and its resources was as a service user. When I decided to go abroad as a postgraduate student, I didn't know where to start. I had a lot of questions and not a lot of answers. So like many people, I took to Google, and Google brought me almost directly to the NCDE. So I really can say I don't think I would have gone abroad if it wasn't for our resources, which are totally free and available to the public. And then I was an access to Exchange Extern, which is a virtual externship offered through the NCDE. So that, again, was kind of a step in the direction of ultimately joining the team. I am now a program coordinator with the NCDE, and I work directly with Justin. And that's that's what brought me to here today with you all. And I'm extremely excited to be here and go a little bit more in depth on the topic. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to go a little bit, we're going to give a little bit of an overview on the next slide. So today's session, just very briefly, is going to hit on these main areas. We're going to talk about what is disability. We're going to talk about disability in the context of international exchanges. We're going to offer some tips and best practice in the field, and ultimately we are going to end with a Q&A. But I do want to put it out there that the goal of this session, in the grand scheme of things, it's a short session. It would not be reasonable for us to say you are going to leave today with all of the knowledge in the world related to disability inclusion, with all the knowledge in the world related to exchange, let alone inclusive exchange. So we're not here to make you one-day experts. We're not here to train you in one day how to build fully accessible programs. And to be honest, I like to think of it, accessibility isn't a destination. It's not an end stop on a journey. It really is a point of progress and a point of constant knowledge, constant knowledge seeking and constant skill building. Language is always changing, technology is always changing, and the culture is always changing. So that being said, having kind of told you all the things we can't do today, what can we do? Our hope is to help you better understand the topic as a whole and create a foundation where you have more confidence and more comfort engaging with the space. And ultimately, again, in the space of skill building and knowledge seeking, we're going to be doing a bit of myth busting and helping you understand that some of the preconceived notions we have about disability, honestly, at this point, might be wrong. And it's time to confront those wrong ideas about disability, and especially those wrong ideas about how disability operates in the exchange context. And again, just put you in a place where you feel comfortable and confident to take the next step in learning more. So today is about building a foundation, and hopefully invite you to continue talking with us and continue to learn more. So where are we beginning today? We're beginning with the next slide, where we ask the question, what is disability? It's the most fundamental of all questions. And to be honest, there's a couple different ways to answer it. And the next slide offers some of those definitions. So what you see on this slide are some of the more, probably the more technical, the more legal definitions. They're offered by, again, some of the laws. The most, what we would kind of think of as the law of the land when it relates to disabilities would be the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is kind of the prevailing civil rights act related to disability inclusion. And so what this slide says is it highlights, and not just definitions in the context of the ADA, but it also highlights the UNCRPD, which is the United States Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is kind of like an internationally recognized disability point of context for again, disability rights and inclusion. So this slide explains that different definitions of disability include things like a mental or physical impairment impacting one or more life's activities, a long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment, which in interaction with various barriers may impact your participation in society on an equal basis with others being non-disabled people. A medically determinable physical or mental impairment that is expected to last more than 12 months and result in death, and that makes it impossible for the individual to engage with substantial gainful activity. So these are some examples how kind of on paper disability is defined. So of course, definitions of disability do exist and are important. And like I said, so on screen here are some of those definitions, but there's no denying that there have been other definitions put forward that are outdated. There have been previous legislations where what is now commonly referred to as the R word was written into law. And now we know, as time has passed, we don't use that language anymore. We learned more and we're doing better. And that's true today. We continue to learn more and we continue to do better. And you might see that reflected on your own campuses or at your own institutions where your offices of accessibility might have recently changed names and all those kinds of things. So language is a space where we often hear people say, I want to know what to say. I want to know the right words. I want to make sure I'm not hurting people's feelings. I'm using the terms people prefer. And that's the key thing. You're using the terms people prefer. So it's about entering spaces with openness, but it's also about understanding where these words come from. And on the next slide, we're going to look a little bit more about where this language originated and kind of what the different language systems imply. So as with a lot of different spaces, language just doesn't kind of pop up out of nowhere. It comes from how people engage with society. So the two main ways disability has presented itself in society are often kind of boiled down to the medical model of disability, and the social model of disability. So on screen now, we have the medical model of disability and the social model of disability broken down. So the medical model of disability describes that disability is an internal characteristic related to a diagnosis, and that it is something to be cured or removed from a person. The experts in the field of the experts in the medical model of disability are field professionals. This includes people like medical doctors, researchers, sociologists, professors. The list goes on. So those are considered the experts under the medical model of disability. And you might see some language reflected in the previous slide in those definitions when we talk about physical impairments, when we talk about conditions. That language feels quite clinical, and that has to do with a lot of that language being developed using a medical model of disability. So the social model of disability on the right side of the screen, that model of disability was developed kind of as a response to the disability rights movement in the 1960s and the 1970s, where disabled people were starting to, the momentum was building long before that, but disabled people were being more readily recognized as active citizens in society after a long hard battle to be recognized in that way. And so the social model explains that disability is a result of environmental barriers. So rather than being a result of an internal characteristic, an internal impairment, disability comes from environmental barriers, and removing these obstacles leads to inclusion. So for example, we often see, again, a clear-cut example of this. Often people describe how someone who is a wheelchair user, under the medical model, the fact that they are a wheelchair user makes them disabled. Under the social model, being a wheelchair user might be a disability, but if you're a wheelchair user and buildings have ramps and elevators, you're no longer disabled by being a wheelchair user. You're disabled because the building is inaccessible. Buildings don't have ramps, elevators. So it kind of puts it, the social model puts the onus of change. The social model says society can change to be inclusive, rather than the medical model saying curing the individuals cures disability. And the experts under the social model are people with lived experience with disability, disabled people themselves. And what I think is particularly impactful about the social model of disability as people in the exchange field, it means you have the power to make change here by listening to participants, by engaging with disabled colleagues, by hiring disabled people in the field. We can change these environments to be inclusive, to be accessible. So again, this reflects, what is disability? These are different ways to understand it. And the other ways that the medical model and the social model, again, are reflected in day-to-day life comes with disability language, which we're going to explore more on this next slide. So disability language, again, this is a topic that comes up quite frequently when people are trying to build their skill set in the field of disability inclusion. We come back to, okay, so what do I say? How do I talk about this? And two key ways to do this are understanding person first language and identity first language. So person first language, it is what it says on the tin. You focus on the person first. So this looks like saying a person with a disability, a person who is blind, a person who uses a wheelchair, a person who is deaf, a person with autism. This sometimes is aligned with the medical model because it says a person, it separates the person from their disability a little bit, as opposed to identity first language, which very closely aligns a person with their disability. It says, you cannot separate me from my disability because I am a disabled person. I am a blind person. I am a deaf person. I am a wheelchair user or a wheelchair rider. I am an autistic person. So these are just two ways to approach disability. And ultimately, again, when this is happening in practice, it comes from a point of culture. You might see people, for example, this might come up a lot of times in the chronic illness community. a lot of times people in the chronic illness community are interested in curing their illness, and that's okay. They don't identify as disabled. Perhaps the person that you're working with who's interested in going abroad has diabetes, and they might not identify as disabled. They might not identify as a diabetic. They might say, I have diabetes, and that's it. And they might one day they might be interested in a cure for diabetes. There is nothing wrong or bad about that. We are not asking you to convince people to say that they are a disabled person or to say that they are a person with disability. We're just saying these are language practices that are put into use every day, and we hope that you are comfortable, and that when the participant is entering your space, you're creating a space where they feel comfortable telling you what language they prefer. And more importantly, when you're creating recruitment materials and advising materials and all those kinds of things, you're using language that opens itself up to being inclusive. And why is it important to have inclusive language? Well, we see this in practice on the next slide, because again, a tangible piece of disability inclusion often comes into play when we talk about the provision of reasonable accommodations. Where, like I said, but today is about Disability 101. We're hitting all the hot topics, and it's no secret that reasonable accommodations are a very important part of the space. So what is a reasonable accommodation? Reasonable accommodation or a reasonable accommodation is an auxiliary aid or policy adjustment that enables a person with a disability to benefit from a good service or educational or vocational opportunity. So again, calling back on the social model of disability, we're talking about environmental adjustments to promote inclusion. So these are ways we are dismantling barriers to inclusion so people with disabilities can participate fully. So some common reasonable accommodations listed on this slide. They include extra time or flexible deadlines on exams or assignments, sign language interpreters, note takers or alternative media, accessible housing and transportation, flexible attendance, a screen reader using a microphone. And this is just a very short list. The list goes on and on and on, because like I said, technology changes quite frequently. Options are endless. A reasonable accommodation might be something as quick and easy as an extra pillow in a dorm room. And the point here is we are creating spaces where these opportunities should be readily available to students, not as participants, not as a helpful, these practices are not out of pity or because of it's a bonus. These are basic rights that students are entitled to under the ADA, and to better understand how they're put into practice and all those kinds of things, to better understand the laws and all of the kind of the nuanced pieces. We could have an entire day just to talk about reasonable accommodations. This is a great jumping off point for further exploration. But this is again to get you comfortable with the language and kind of the next steps, and to also say that you should be working in collaboration with other departments and with us at the NCDE to put things like this into practice. Don't get overwhelmed by how the options and the opportunities are endless. It's just, don't also be shocked if a participant comes into your office and says, I want to go abroad, but I'm concerned about my reasonable accommodations. We don't want you to be in a state of panic over a next step. Be ready, be prepared, and we're here to help you get to that sense of preparedness. And on the next slide, we're going to hit on, well, how can you get prepared? What does that look like? And kind of the trigger for putting these reasonable accommodations into place often comes from disclosure. So disclosure is the act of sharing information about disability with others. So telling someone you have a disability. Maybe you're just telling them that you have a disability because you want them to know, but oftentimes you're telling them that you have a disability because you're seeking out services, you're seeking out a reasonable accommodation. And something that some concerns and feedback that we often hear are, well, students just aren't disclosing, or how do we get students to disclose sooner, or what happens if they disclose too late, or what happens when they don't disclose at all, or they only told us once they were abroad and then we couldn't figure out how to get things in place, and all those kinds of things. And we're here to tell you that students with disabilities are more likely to disclose when they think that there is a benefit to doing so, but most importantly, when and I'm going to go a little bit more into depth about how to encourage disclosure, but the important thing is to understand that none of this is happening in a vacuum. We hit on previous slides, and this is where I'm going to talk about kind of the myth busting aspect of disability inclusion. You know, your participants' day-to-day life about disability might not be pleasant. They might have faced some serious discriminatory practices related to their disability in the past. So by saying we just need them to disclose, we just want them to disclose, there might have been a point in their lifetime where they did disclose and then something bad happened because of it. And so we need to be remembering that in our journey to be disability inclusive, we also need to spend time becoming aware of how ableism is present and how structural ableism is at play in the language that we're using and in the practices that we have in play, so that we are building environments where disclosure is possible. Because some students, like I said, it hasn't worked for them in the past, and we need to make it work for them. And one way to do that is a universal design for learning approach. We should be building environments that are as accessible as possible from the beginning. And this is, I should just have a running list of buzzwords for your own Googling later on. I hope universal design for learning is one of them. But the idea is we are building environments from the beginning that are as inclusive as possible, so that the need for disclosure and the need for reasonable accommodations is minimized because they're inclusive from the beginning. Again, I'll use the example of ramps and elevators. If when new buildings are going up on campus, we are designing them with accessibility features in mind, we won't need to retroactively build in those features. We won't need to retroactively have people disclose so we can put those features in place. So again, universal design for learning is a great approach to have so that disclosure becomes less important. But as it stands now, disclosure is important. So on the next slide, we'll talk about how to encourage it. So before going on exchange, again, the key piece here is making sure that we're creating environments that disclosure is coming from a place of positivity and a place of empowerment. So before exchange, we should be offering opportunities for students to share about their experiences and be clear and positive about disability inclusion. This means things like including guidelines and procedures about supports available locally and supports available in the host country. We're talking about different accessibility features. We're talking about potentially having advising sessions that are specifically geared toward disability inclusion, things like that, making it clear and obvious that disability inclusion in exchanges is possible, is a priority, and is a good thing. And so once these participants do apply and are accepted, we should continue sharing these resources and policies so that, again, we're staying proactive. We're staying in constant communication, and so that every step along the way, students have the opportunity to disclose in a way that is safe and in a way that is empowering. And again, all the way through while being abroad, these lines of communications are there because things might come up while the student is abroad. They might be encountering new barriers that they didn't experience in their home country. And now a reasonable accommodation abroad might be necessary that wasn't necessary domestically. And similarly, I think it's important to remember disability can happen at any time. And so students who have no past experience with disability and no lived experience with disability, who have never needed to disclose before, all of a sudden might need to do so. And so now we're talking about maybe the student who is abroad and was on a night out, might have stayed out a little too late. Now they fell and broke their leg and they're panicked about being sent home. So they don't tell anyone. And now they've been in the hospital, they've gotten a cast, all these kinds of things, and they're not telling anyone because they don't want to get in trouble. But they might need a wheelchair for the remainder of their time abroad. They might need additional medical attention. And in some cases, they might need to be brought home. And we need to create spaces where students feel comfortable and confident telling you these things. And those spaces come from being disability positive and disability forward at the beginning. And ultimately, we have to remember, we can't blame participants when they don't disclose. Because like I said, there are participants out there who don't think they have a disability, don't believe they have a disability. And it's true. If that's what they think and that's how they feel, that's the end of it. Again, on paper, they might qualify for grants, they might qualify for supports, and they might pursue those grants and supports, but culturally, they might not identify as part of the disability community, and that's okay. But we still have to proceed with processes that involve things like disclosure and reasonable accommodations, but it doesn't mean we have to label, and it doesn't mean we have to force students to engage with topics that they're not comfortable or happy with. But overall, this is just to say that it's reinforcing why we as practitioners need to be, again, comfortable and confident walking through these topics with each other and engaging with these topics with our participants. And one way that we can engage with these topics, especially with participants, is featured on our next slide. And it's something that I, as someone who is chronically ill, I rely on this in my day-to-day life. And I'm particularly active on the social media side of the disability community. I've found quite a community there, and it's been exciting to see how. So this slide highlights spoon theory, and it's been exciting to see how spoon theory as a tool has really been put into practice, not only in the social side of disability, but in the academic and the student services space. So what is spoon theory? If you may be familiar with the theory of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, we're talking about the pyramid where it's students' basic needs like food, shelter, those kinds of things aren't being met. They can't get to those higher level of needs like straight A's. Spoon theory would be quite similar in that respect, but it's a tool where it was developed by someone with chronic illness, and they were just explaining to a friend why their day-to-day doesn't look the same as a non-disabled person. And so what spoon theory does, and now I'm regretting not having a prop. I could have used a spoon beside me. But so the way spoon theory works is this woman said, imagine you wake up every day, and we're talking about a literal spoon, like the thing that you eat with. You wake up every day with if you're a non-disabled person, you wake up every day with unlimited amounts of spoons. But some people with certain disabilities wake up every day with 10 spoons. And spoons represent units of energy. So non-disabled people might have all the energy in the world, whereas someone with a chronic illness, for example, they have to ration. They have to say, I need 1 spoon just to get out of bed. To brush my teeth, I need another spoon. And now if we're talking about studying, we're talking about doing a walking tour, we're talking about trying to socialize, we're talking about taking a flight, where all of these things add up, and your energy levels might hit the negatives. So that's kind of just an overview of what spoon theory is and how it interacts on a day-to-day. But as a tool, we're seeing it put in practice where exchange advisors might be able to check in with students and say, how are your spoons today? And similarly, what we're seeing is student groups being organized on campus where student clubs are becoming spoony unis. So again, this has become a point of community building for disabled people, as well as a way to communicate needs and a way to have those needs met. Because if you're finding out that you have a participant who is negative spoons for the majority of their trip, they might be in need of a reasonable accommodation. So again, this is a tool to engage with conversation and to be used as a potential check-in. And there's nothing to say you can't throw a spoon theory poster up in your office as a visual representation of being disability inclusive. We're seeing students walk around with spoon pins. All these kinds of things are becoming more and more popular and things we should be aware of as practitioners. And so that's kind of hitting on some of the tools and the systems and the language. But the next slide will kind of get to the core of the issue, which maybe we could have started with, but I'm glad we kind of left it to here. And this is the question of, can participants with disabilities even go abroad? And just I'm gonna flip real quick to the next slide, please, Lori. Because here with my USA and the NCDE, we kind of have this practice of, start with yes, start with yes. Yes, we can do this, and together we'll problem solve getting to how. And I'm going to with a certain amount of joy and excitement, go ahead and on the next slide, use myself as a little bit of a case study here. So hopefully you recognize me. I'm a little younger in this picture, but what you have on your screen here is a picture of myself. So I did say in my introduction, I'd go a little bit more in depth about me, and I promised I would. Here I am fulfilling that promise. So this is a picture of me. I like I said, I'm chronically ill. I have a neurological condition called hydrocephalus. And the way that my condition is treated is through a medically implanted device. So you can't see it on my day-to-day. I have something which might be referred to as an invisible disability or a hidden disability, a non-apparent disability. I'm comfortable with all language. I don't really use one over the other. But just to say that this picture shows my medically implanted device, a model of it on the outside. I actually have 3 of these shunts inside me right now. And this is what is keeping me alive. And I am someone who can only be kept alive through occasional brain surgery. I don't know when it might happen. It might never happen again. But I also know people with hydrocephalus who have needed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of brain surgeries. And this kind of unpredictable element of my condition, on top of needing certain therapies or medications, those kinds of things, I didn't think I could go abroad. Nobody told me I couldn't exactly, but it was just something that I grew up, I need certain hospitals, I need certain doctors. It's not a reality for me. But again, as I kind of grew in independence, and it was something I always wanted to do, but there weren't many people telling me, just try it. But again, independence grew, I tried new things, and eventually I said, you know what? I mentioned this before. I did a little Googling, and I read some stories in the NCDE resource library about participants with similar conditions that went abroad. And I said, I think I'm going to try it. So on the next slide, I'm happy to say that I did. I moved abroad for my postgraduate degree program. I got my master's at University College Dublin in equality studies. I focused my research on disability inclusion in international exchange. So on the left, you have a picture of me feeding a donkey, thrilled with my life. I'm going to say that moment is why I went abroad. No, on the right is the moment why I went abroad. That's me on graduation day with my Master's of Science. And I took it one step further, and I actually stayed and I worked on a stay back visa. That was my first real experience in the international exchange field. And I was thrilled to be doing it. COVID did hit almost immediately to me starting work. So that was a bit of a lot. Now I was abroad, chronically ill and in a COVID lockdown. But I was doing it. I made it and I was making the most of it. And, but Irish rainbows don't happen without a little bit of Irish rain. And so on the next slide, to be transparent, after 15 years of not needing any brain surgery in the middle of a COVID lockdown, I did have what is called a shunt malfunction, and I did have to pursue, I had to pursue brain surgery in a foreign country in the middle of lockdown. And that was a lot. And that right there was my moment of, I couldn't go abroad for that reason. And then it happened. But I was incredibly well prepared for that worst case scenario. And it was fine. You know, like, here I am. It all worked. And I'm glad I did it. So that was just a real quick kind of narrative example of a student who might have started out as a hard no, and then the impossible became possible. So again, on the next slide, we're back to the start with yes and problem solve how. How did I problem solve getting abroad? So some questions to consider are highlighted on this next slide. So some questions to consider. What are the housing options? I did not feel comfortable going abroad as someone, again, who was chronically ill. I had never been to Ireland before. I moved there totally sight unseen. These were conversations that I had with some some people in advisory positions. It was questions that I pursued in the NCDE resource library. What's the best option for me? I decided to live on campus, so I didn't have to also cope with a commute. Transportation, similarly, I had to wonder, you know, how will my medical devices work with a long haul flight? I consulted doctors. We answered those questions. So again, it's, instead of making a list of reasons why students shouldn't go abroad, make a checklist of questions to answer to make the going abroad possible. So again, just to finish this list of questions to consider that are listed on this screen. So housing options, transportation, counseling services, sign language interpretation and card availability, rules and regulations on service emotional support animals, time for breaks, coverage for pre-existing conditions, conditions for travel insurer, controlled medications. And I'm gonna pause for 1 second at the coverage for pre-existing conditions. So for example, when I moved to Ireland, part of the visa regulations where you had to pay into private Irish health insurance, but there was a 5-year waiting period to be covered for pre-existing conditions. So I was required to pay for health insurance I couldn't use. And that stunk, but I did it. I'm saying this to reinforce our power as people in the field. And again, what I think is a useful space for us. I made it clear to the people that ultimately briefly became my colleagues on my stay back visa, that I felt that was an injustice. I said I was doing this and I didn't think it was right. And they heard me and they took it forward and they collaborated with other people. And now in Ireland, there is a health insurance plan specifically for international students that waives that waiting period for pre-existing conditions. And, you know, I say this again as a bit of a case study to say, learning more about disability inclusion in international exchange isn't just for the case-by-case basis of if a disabled student is trying to go abroad one time. We are positioned as providers and as professionals to be agents of sustainable change. And the laws and regulations for disability inclusion didn't come out of nowhere. And that's also true for the international exchange field. And I think that that's an important part of Disability 101 is knowing that, again, there are next steps beyond this. And then we should be considering those next steps as well, so that it's not so hard the next time another student wants to go abroad. So again, now you have students that want to go, you have participants that want to go. What makes the whole thing a little bit easier? And on the next slide, this is what makes it easier, working with other people. So some collaborations and great points of contact. First and foremost, MyUSA and the NCDE. The National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange is your free resource on disability inclusion and international exchange. We are here to support you and to support participants to have disability inclusive exchange opportunities. Talk to us. talk to us, I think, again, I would not have gone abroad if I didn't spend weeks exploring the resource library and reading the stories of other participants that, again, had done my impossible thing. And then being able to talk to professionals and say, you know what, yeah, you can do that, makes a big difference. And other people that you should consider reaching out to and collaborating with are exchange providers, your tour operators, disability services on campus, the counseling centers, travel insurers, and then disabled people's organizations locally and abroad. I, again, as someone with hydrocephalus, I consulted with my pre-existing medical team, but I also almost immediately reached out to, because I had seen this tip in the NCDE resource library, I reached out to Spina Bifida Hydrocephalus Ireland. I said, what does it look like to be someone with hydrocephalus living in Ireland? What are the hospitals? What are the social circles? All those kinds of things mattered to setting myself up for success for that worst case scenario, which ultimately became my my real scenario that ended up not being so bad because I was so well prepared. So collaboration is key. And the last things we're going to end on here, I know I have an eye on the clock and I want to make sure that we have time. And because these slides will be available, I'm not going to read all of the tips that are on them. So these are some tips about health insurance. But again, something to consider is a lot of health insurance will not typically cover pre-existing conditions. So these are the tips about health insurance. And then the next slide has tips related to medication and how to travel with medication. You know what, if we could stay on the health insurance slide, I will just read it quickly. I don't think it will take that long. So travel health insurance plans do not typically cover ongoing care for pre-existing conditions. You should check if the travel insurance plan for the program offers the option to purchase extra coverage, which is sometimes called a waiver. You should check to see if a participant could be covered by a national healthcare service. Check if a participant could self-insure, possibly in middle and low income countries. And some fellowship programs like Fulbright may cover elevated healthcare costs if it is considered a reasonable accommodation. So the next slide is tips and information related to medications. So for shorter programs, students can pursue a 90-day supply of medications before departure, but you should bear in mind that some pain control and psychotropic medications may be considered controlled substances in other countries, and you might not be able to travel with them. So you should check if the policy of the host country, through international narcotics control, through the International Narcotics Control Board or with embassies. You should travel with medications in original packaging. Participants typically cannot send medications through the mail, and prescriptions from a US doctor may be enough for pharmacies in a host country, but you should always collaborate with domestic and international medical teams. Tips and information related to flights is next. And so you should always check the airline's website for its reasonable accommodations policy. You can contact airlines a couple days in advance to request accommodations. You should transport medications in a separate suitcase so they don't count against an airline's carry-on limits. And you should not be charged additional costs for medically related devices. You can travel with up to two wheelchairs, and that should be checked for free. And you should consider collaborating with TSA Cares or the Hidden Disability Sunflower Scheme. These are all opportunities to have the most inclusive airport experience possible. The next slide is tips and information related to equipment. So larger chairs may need to be partially disassembled during flight. You should carry instructions if this is the case. You should consider bringing voltage converters for adaptive equipment. You should research places where a wheelchair can be repaired in your host country. It's best if you have larger front casters, consider a free wheel to raise your front casters off the ground. And ultimately, you should always remember to consult local disabled persons organizations about best practices and possible rentals or replacements in case of an emergency. Next is tips and information related to personal care assistants and sign language interpreters. There's some overlap between these two, but of course they are different, personal care assistants and sign language interpreters. but you can find these great. You can find these assistants in your home or host country. You should check about financial aid to support the funding of these services. And you should always remember that there is likely going to be extra housing related to these services. And the kind of additional step to that is there might be further immigration requirements because this is an extra person involved. You should always remember that ASL interpreters may be harder to find in other countries where ASL is not commonly used. And ultimately, for both personal care assistants and sign language interpreters, you need to be clear and proactive about boundaries and when you're developing contracts, and about when they are expected to provide their services. And lastly, just a quick note on service animals. You should remember to check the USDA's animal and plant health inspection services. The APHIS is how I say it in my head. I rarely say it out loud. APHIS, the pet dog. Oh yeah, that's the acronym for APHIS anyway. Pet and dog import and export guidelines for the host country. EU countries will require an EU pet passport, and others may have a similar health certification scheme. Island countries may require you quarantine an animal. Assistant Dogs International ADI certifies schools around the world. And many countries do not recognize handler trained service animals. So in the US, under the ADA, disabled people are entitled to train their own animals. So it might be possible that participants don't have some sort of registration for them, but they might need to pursue that before going abroad. So you should verify that the dog is trained by an ADA certified school. And just keep in mind that some dogs are considered unclean in some countries, and in other countries, stray dog populations may interfere with the service animal. So that idea of disability as a cultural element is something to consider across the board. Just how is disability, the language around disability, how are the laws around disability, and just how is the culture of disability overall different in the host country in comparison to what the participant might be accustomed to in their domestic country. So that was just a real quick overview of those slides. And ultimately, some next steps for you to take forward from this presentation, of course, are to visit the online resource library of the NCDE, which you can find at myusa.org/resource. You can contact us directly at clearinghouse@myusa.org, and consider signing up for our monthly Access to Exchange e-news, which you can also do at myusa.org. In that library and on our website, you can find, which is featured on our next slide, one of our more recent resources, which is called Away Topics, and it is a primer. So it's Disability Inclusion and International Exchange, a primer for exchange professionals. It covers many of the topics we talked about today, and the resources connected to those topics are directly linked in this document. So again, I think it's a really great next step after this presentation. And on the next slide, we have one of our current initiatives is the Campus Collaboration Initiative. So for people looking to engage in a next step and build kind of their community of practice, this is definitely an opportunity to consider pursuing. And lastly, oh, sorry, that was the last one. My apologies, everyone. I slide last minute and then forgot to send it to everyone, so I apologize. But very lastly, there is a book coming out called I will copy and paste it into the chat during the Q&A so people will have it. But a book related to the legal policies surrounding disability inclusion that again might be a great next step for people looking to better understand practices in that space. So I have not had an eye on the chat because I was busy. But at this point, if there are questions that we could hit on, I know that we're we said an hour. We're coming up on that, so my apologies. But if there are questions that anyone would like us to answer, I'm happy to try. Otherwise, again, we are directly reachable through that email, and hopefully this has been helpful. And just as a reminder, this was recorded and will be available. If
Thanks,
there is a
Lindsay.
question, thanks, Justin. I was going to say, I don't know if
all I'm hearing
if
are
someone has a question.
congratulations.
Thanks.
It's a lot of thanks.
So I was going to say, I can scroll up in the chat, but otherwise, if there's anything anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask, we could also stop recording at this stage if anyone would be more comfortable asking their question outside of the recording, or again, just you can contact us directly. We are here to help.
Clearinghouse@miusa.org.
That's great. Thanks,
Lindsay,
Justin.
Marta had earlier asked a question about information for folks who were coming to the US.
Sure.
And anticipating situations and accommodations in the US. And we have lots of resources on our website considering what we call sort of inbound or international students coming to the US.
Yes, that thank you, Lori, because that's a great reminder. So I briefly touched on the ADA, so the Americans with Disabilities Act, and just to clarify that participants that arrive in the US, they are not US citizens, they are covered under the ADA. And I think that that's really important to understand. And so that means when these students arrive, they will have the same access to disability services, all of those kinds of things. And honestly, a lot of the tips and tricks as they they work in both directions. We would highly recommend students coming to the US consider reaching out to local disabled person organizations, whether it's directly related to their disability or it's just simply in their newfound local area. Build those connections before they arrive is a great first step. But as Lori mentioned, these resources are vast, they are descriptive, and they are incredibly practical and immediately able to be implemented, or just honestly fun to read. So many of them, we often talk about the power of storytelling and just seeing yourself reflected in it happening, so those students who might have concerns, they might just find a story that reflects their concerns and eases the worry a little bit. So again, the resource library is a great next step.
Hi, I have a question. I'm an overseas study director in Spain. And my question is, with students sometimes come with accommodations of reduced course load.
Sure.
Have you heard, and it's something that's come up, we haven't really addressed it, but technically speaking, in order to get a student visa, they have to have over 20 hours of classwork a week. And so if a student under enrolls because of the accommodation, have you known, and anyone know if there's been any conflicts with their visas to study abroad? Because they wouldn't be meeting the requirement of the visa. I don't know if you have encountered this.
We have seen that for people coming to the United States, when especially people are coming for full-time degree programs on an F1 visa. They are one of the requirements is that they be registered for a full load of classes, which in the United States is 12 credits or more, which I think more or less works out to be 3 or 4 classes. And I'm not as familiar though with the Spanish context right now, but yes, that is an example where I've seen that before. There are some limited areas in our context where someone can ask for an exception, and in the case of a medical a medical situation, a medical condition. And but I'm not 100% aware. I mean, theoretically, there's a way for someone to continue asking for extensions, and I'm not 100% aware if that's worked out or not.
And I think just to add to what Justin mentioned, I think this is another good example of how early collaboration is useful, because I've seen in practice where, again, having to, so for example, not being able to enroll as a part-time student because you have to be full-time to qualify for the visa, but being able to collaborate with the disabilities office or the access office at the destination institution and have a needs assessment done early, to be able to be in communication with the academic side of the team to say, you know what, we can't reduce the amount of courses you take, but we might be able to reduce the amount of assessments in those courses. Like to be able to take kind of a slightly creative approach to say, you know, maybe some of these courses will have essay optional kind of thing, you know, just attacking it from a different angle to see how the reasonable accommodations can be adjusted so that the spirit of it is still being honored. But it's just not a one-for-one. We see it often that the reasonable accommodations cannot be one-for-one, but there's just another way to get it to match, for lack of a better word.
That's a great idea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, everyone, thank you for your questions. And that it is now 3:04 Eastern, 12:04 Pacific. And so I think this is probably going to conclude our webinar. So many thanks to Lindsay for your amazing presentation. Thank you all for joining us. We had a great attendance, I think more or less about 45 people attending, and an amazing registration too, over 100 registrants. And you will all receive a recording with a transcript and a satisfaction survey. So please fill the survey out and please enjoy the recording and transcript. And please join us for our next presentation, which is going to be on April 30th. And it's going to be about the things they bring, all the reasonable accommodations that people with disabilities travel with, and the things that you should know about those accommodations. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for coming.